What happens when the funniest man in the room suddenly stops laughing and the entire studio realizes the joke might be on them? Before we dive into this unforgettable moment, make sure you subscribe to Live Narratives, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because tonight's story isn't just another celebrity interview. It's the moment laughter turned into silence. The lights inside the studio of The View gleamed like polished glass. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, that familiar hum that floats just before the cameras roll. Producers whispered into headsets. The audience coordinator flashed cue cards. And at the center of it all sat the legendary EGOT winner, the unshakable moderator herself, Whoopi Goldberg, calm, composed, hands folded like she'd seen every storm television could offer. But she hadn't seen this one. The announcer's voice boomed through the studio. Please welcome the one and only Jim Carrey. The doors swung open, and Jim Carrey burst onto the stage like a human firework.
He spun.
He bowed dramatically. He pretended to trip over nothing. The audience roared instantly. That laugh, his laugh, filled the room, elastic and contagious. He shook hands with the co-hosts, hugging one a little too long for comedic effect, wagging his eyebrows at the camera. Whoopi smiled, but it was measured. Observing. Jim plopped into his chair and crossed his legs in exaggerated elegance. I wore my serious socks today, he announced, pulling up his pant legs slightly. They mean business. Laughter again. Whoopi leaned in, voice steady. We're always ready for whatever you bring, Jim. Oh, that's dangerous. Jim shot back, eyes widening theatrically. Nobody's ever ready for what I bring. I barely am. The crowd loved it. The energy was electric. For the first few minutes, it was classic Carrey. Elastic expressions, absurd metaphors, playful self-mockery. He joked about Hollywood, about fame, about accidentally talking to himself in the mirror and losing the argument. But something underneath it all felt sharp. Whoopi shifted the conversation. You've been doing a lot of interviews lately, she said casually. Talking about the industry, about truth, about illusions. Jim tilted his head slowly. The grin didn't disappear, but it stiffened. Oh yes, he replied. The illusion factory. I know it well. A ripple moved through the audience. Not laughter this time, curiosity. Whoopi nodded. You've said some things that raised eyebrows. About how fame is a mask. About how Hollywood is, your word, a circus. Jim leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. Isn't it, he asked lightly. Bright lights. Costumes. People pretending to be something they're not. The co-hosts exchanged glances. The mood shifted half a degree. Whoopi didn't flinch. You've benefited from that circus. And I'm grateful, Jim replied quickly. Too quickly. Deeply grateful. It gave me everything. Money, attention, applause. He paused. And it tried to take everything too. Silence fell like a curtain. You could almost hear the audience inhale. Whoopi's voice softened but sharpened at the same time. Try to take what? Jim's smile faded. Not dramatically, not theatrically. Just faded. Like someone slowly dimming a stage light. Me, he said. No punchline followed. A few nervous chuckles fluttered in the back rows, but they died quickly. Whoopi leaned forward now, sensing the shift. What do you mean by that? Jim's eyes scanned the audience. Not in performance, almost in search. There's a version of you that the world falls in love with, he began quietly. And then there's you. And if you're not careful, you start living for the version they love. The room felt smaller somehow. One of the co-hosts attempted to lighten the tone. Well, people love you because you make them laugh. Jim turned to her, expression unreadable. Do they? Or do they love that I distract them from themselves? A murmur swept across the audience. Whoopi's posture straightened. She'd hosted political debates, celebrity feuds, cultural firestorms. But this wasn't loud. It was something else. Intimate. Uncomfortable. Are you saying your career was dishonest? She asked. Jim shook his head slowly. No. I'm saying it was survival. The word hung there. The cameras zoomed in subtly, capturing every micro-expression. Whoopi's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in assessment. You think the rest of us are just surviving too? She asked carefully. Jim smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. Aren't we? The audience shifted in their seats. This wasn't slapstick. This wasn't rubber-faced comedy. This was something raw. Whoopi crossed her legs deliberately. There's a difference between performance and deception, she said firmly. Some of us choose this life knowing exactly what it is. Jim nodded slowly. And some of us wake up one day realizing we became the character. The temperature in the studio felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. A producer off-camera gestured subtly, perhaps signaling to steer back towards safer territory. But Whoopi didn't look away. You sound angry, she observed. Jim's jaw tightened for the first time. I'm not angry, he said. Then a beat. I'm awake. There it was. A collective silence swallowed the studio whole. Whoopi's voice lowered. Awake to what, Jim? He leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, eyes locked onto hers. To the cost. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. And somewhere between the stage lights and the stunned faces in the crowd, it became clear this wasn't going to be a normal interview. Something deeper was surfacing. Something neither side seemed fully prepared to handle. Whoopi held his gaze. And who pays that cost? She asked. Jim didn't blink. Everyone, he said. The camera cut to the audience. Wide eyes, parted lips, hands frozen mid-clap that never came. The laughter had vanished. And the silence? It was just beginning. The silence didn't break. It stretched. You could almost hear the hum of the studio lights overhead, that faint electric buzz that normally disappears beneath laughter and applause. Now it felt loud, intrusive, exposing. Jim Carrey sat forward, elbows pressed into his knees, fingers loosely clasped. The man who once contorted his face into 100 shapes without effort now looked still, painfully still. Whoopi Goldberg studied him carefully. Years in front of cameras had trained her not to blink first. Everyone, she repeated, her voice calm but firm. That's a big statement. Jim exhaled slowly through his nose, almost like he was releasing something heavier than air. You don't build a fantasy world without asking people to live inside it, he said. And when they do, they start believing it's real. A co-host shifted in her chair. Hollywood is storytelling, she interjected gently. That's not deception. That's art. Jim turned toward her, nodding as if he respected the counterpoint. Art is truth wrapped in imagination, he replied. But what happens when imagination replaces truth? A murmur rippled through the audience again, soft, uncertain. Whoopi leaned back slightly, crossing her arms now. You're painting a picture that suggests this industry is some kind of villain, she said. But it's also given people hope, inspiration, escape. Jim's eyes flickered. For a split second, the old spark returned. Escape, he echoed. Exactly. He stood up suddenly, not in anger, but with restless energy. The movement startled the audience. A few gasps slipped out before they could be swallowed. Think about it, he continued, pacing slowly in front of the table. A kid somewhere feels small, invisible. Then he sees someone on a screen who makes him laugh, makes him forget his pain for 90 minutes. That's beautiful. He paused mid-step. But then what? Whoopi didn't look intimidated, but she was alert now. Then he goes back to his life, she said evenly. And maybe it's a little lighter. Jim stopped walking, turned toward her. Or maybe, he said quietly, he waits for the next distraction instead of facing the reason he needed one. The room tightened. This wasn't playful philosophical banter anymore. This felt personal. Whoopi's eyes sharpened. Are you talking about the audience? She asked. Or yourself? The question landed hard. Jim smiled faintly, but it trembled at the edges. Both. A camera zoomed in on his face. There was no rubbery exaggeration there now. Just a man balancing between vulnerability and defiance. You've been very public about stepping back, Whoopi continued. About reevaluating your life. But don't you think there's a responsibility that comes with telling millions of people the world they love is an illusion? Jim tilted his head slightly. Is it more responsible to let them believe it isn't? A few scattered claps broke out, uncertain, hesitant, before fading quickly under the weight of the moment. One of the co-hosts tried to redirect again. "Let's not forget," she said with a forced brightness, "you're promoting a project today. A comedy." Jim chuckled softly. "Of course I am." He returned to his seat slowly. "Because that's the dance, right? We peel back the curtain just enough to look brave, then we sell tickets." The audience reacted this time. Not laughter, not applause. Just a collective, uncomfortable shifting. Whoopi leaned in again, this time more direct. "Are you saying you don't believe in your own work anymore?" Jim's jaw flexed. "I believe in moments," he said. "When laughter connects people. When something absurd reveals something honest." He paused. "But I don't believe in pretending that applause fills the hole." There was again that crack in the performance. Whoopi's tone softened, but her words sharpened. "You think the rest of us don't know that?" Jim blinked. She continued, "You think I've been sitting at this table all these years, thinking television defines me? That I don't know the difference between who I am and what I do?" A flicker of tension sparked between them. Jim's voice lowered. "Then why defend it so fiercely?" The audience collectively held its breath. Whoopi didn't hesitate. "Because it's not the machine that hurts people," she said firmly. "It's how people use it. Blaming the stage for the actor's confusion. That's convenient." A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the crowd. Jim's expression hardened, not into anger, but into something wounded. "Convenient," he repeated. "Yes," Whoopi replied. "You had agency. You chose roles. You chose fame. You cashed the checks. You can't wake up now and act like you were hypnotized." The word hit like a slap. Jim leaned back slowly in his chair, eyes narrowing just slightly. "You're right," he said quietly. "I chose it." The tension in his voice wasn't loud. It was tight, controlled. "And I paid for it," he added. A co-host interjected carefully, sensing the storm building. "Paid how?" Jim hesitated. For the first time, he looked unsure whether to answer. The studio felt suffocating now. "Paid with peace," he said finally. "Paid with relationships. Paid with a sense of self that took years to rebuild." The vulnerability in his voice cracked through the tension like lightning. Whoopi's expression softened, but only slightly. "That's not unique to Hollywood," she said. "That's life." Jim met her gaze again. "Then why does everyone pretend it's glamorous?" The question echoed. A camera panned across the audience. Some nodded subtly. Others looked conflicted. Whoopi sighed, just barely. "Because sometimes glamour is what gets people through the day," she replied. "Not everyone has the luxury of existential crises." The words hung heavy. Jim's lips parted as if to respond, but he stopped. Something in that sentence had landed deeper than expected. A beat passed, long enough to be uncomfortable on live television. Then Jim leaned forward once more, voice steady but quieter now. "I'm not attacking you," he said, "or this show. I'm asking a question I wish someone had asked me earlier." "And what's that?" Whoopi pressed. Jim looked directly into the main camera. "What are you willing to trade for applause?" The room went still again. Somewhere backstage, a producer whispered urgently into a headset. Whoopi held her composure, but her fingers tightened slightly around her cue cards. "You're turning this into a warning," she said. "Maybe it is," Jim replied. The air felt electric now, not explosive, but charged. Like something inevitable was approaching. Whoopi's voice dropped lower, more personal. "And what if some of us," she said slowly, "never lost ourselves in the first place?" Jim looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, almost gently, "Then you're stronger than I was." The audience didn't know whether to clap. The cameras kept rolling. And beneath the polished set, beneath the bright smiles painted on posters outside the studio, something had shifted. The conversation wasn't about comedy anymore. It was about identity. And neither of them seemed ready to back down. The tension no longer felt accidental. It felt inevitable. Jim Carrey sat still now, no pacing, no theatrical gestures. The energy that once bounced off him like light off a mirror had folded inward. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg maintained her composure, but the space between them felt charged, like two opposing truths testing each other in real time. A co-host cleared her throat softly, attempting to break the weight in the air. Jim, you've reinvented yourself so many times. Comedy, drama, painting, writing. Isn't transformation part of growth? Jim nodded slowly. It is, he said. But sometimes transformation is just another mask. The audience reacted with a low murmur. Whoopi leaned forward again. So, what's the solution? She asked. Stop performing? Stop entertaining? Shut it all down because it can be misused. Jim shook his head.
No.
I'm not calling for destruction. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm calling for honesty. Honesty about what? Whoopi pressed. About the cost, Jim replied. About the pressure to be on even when you're breaking inside. About how the audience sees the character and forgets there's a human carrying it. A few people in the audience nodded, visibly moved. Whoopi's voice softened, but her eyes remained sharp. You think we don't know that weight? Jim's gaze shifted to her hands resting on the table. I think you carry it differently. A flicker of something crossed Whoopi's face. Was it irritation or recognition? You're assuming, she said evenly, that because I don't frame it the way you do, I haven't felt it. Jim leaned back slightly. Have you? The question wasn't aggressive.
It was direct.
The studio went still again. Whoopi held his gaze unflinching. I've lived through public failures, she said calmly. Through headlines that tried to define me. Through grief that the world watched in real time. I didn't collapse the stage because it was heavy. I learned how to stand on it. Applause erupted, stronger this time, more certain. The audience seemed relieved to have a line to rally behind. Jim waited for it to fade. I respect that, he said quietly. Truly. But strength can also become armor. Whoopi didn't hesitate. And vulnerability can become performance. That one hit. A collective ooh rippled through the room. Jim's jaw tightened just slightly. You think this is a performance? I think, Whoopi replied carefully, that when cameras are on, everything becomes amplified. Even truth. Jim looked down briefly, then back up. So, you're saying I'm exaggerating my awakening? I'm saying, she said, voice firm but measured, that there's a responsibility when you frame your personal struggle as a universal indictment. The words landed heavy. Jim exhaled slowly. Maybe it's not universal, he admitted. Maybe it's just mine. The shift in tone was subtle but powerful. For the first time, he sounded less like a philosopher and more like a man wrestling with himself. One of the co-hosts leaned in gently. You've spoken about losing people close to you, she said. About depression. About stepping away from the spotlight. Do you feel like the public misunderstood that? Jim's eyes flickered. The vulnerability was unmistakable now. Yes, he said simply. The audience quieted again, not tense this time, but attentive. They wanted the funny guy, he continued. The rubber face. The wild energy. When I didn't have that in me, it was like I had failed a contract no one showed me. Whoopi listened carefully. But, she responded, isn't it the nature of fame? People fall in love with what you give them. Jim nodded. Exactly. And when you stop giving it, they feel betrayed. A pause. But that's not cruelty, Whoopi said softly. That's attachment. Jim's expression shifted, conflicted, searching. Attachment can suffocate, he replied. And attachment can isolate, Whoopi countered. The exchange was no longer confrontational. It was philosophical, but deeply personal. The audience sat frozen, caught in the gravity of it. Jim leaned forward again, his voice almost a whisper. I'm not blaming the audience. I'm not blaming Hollywood. I'm saying I lost myself chasing a reflection. And now? Whoopi asked. Now I'm trying to live without one. The line hung in the air like a fragile glass ornament. Whoopi studied him for a long moment before speaking. You know, she said slowly, there's a difference between losing yourself and evolving. Jim tilted his head slightly. Is there? Yes, she replied firmly. Losing yourself implies you were powerless. Evolving means you chose to grow. Jim considered that. Really considered it. You think I'm rewriting my past? He asked. I think, Whoopi said carefully, that pain can distort memory. It can turn choices into traps. A quiet stir moved through the audience. Jim's eyes softened. So, what would you call it? He asked. Whoopi didn't hesitate this time. A chapter. The simplicity of the word seemed to steady the room. Not a prison, she continued. Not a conspiracy. A chapter. Jim leaned back, absorbing that. And what if the chapter cost too much? He asked. Then you close it, Whoopi replied. But you don't burn the book. The audience applauded again, this time not loud, but warm. Jim smiled faintly. Not the exaggerated grin of a comedian, but something genuine. Almost grateful. You're good at this, he said quietly. Whoopi smirked. I've been around. A ripple of soft laughter finally returned, easing the tension just slightly. But it wasn't over. Jim's expression shifted once more, something unresolved still lingering behind his eyes. There's one more thing, he said. The room tightened again. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. Go on. Jim hesitated. For the first time all afternoon, he looked uncertain about speaking. When you sit here, he began slowly, and you moderate conversations about truth and accountability. Do you ever feel like you're part of the same illusion I'm talking about? The question was pointed. Personal. The audience froze again. Whoopi didn't answer immediately. Her face remained composed, but her silence spoke volumes. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker. Finally, she responded. I think, she said carefully, that platforms can either amplify noise or illuminate reality. The difference depends on how you use them. Jim nodded slightly. And do you think we illuminate reality? He asked. Whoopi met his gaze head-on. I think we try, she said. A beat. And sometimes trying is enough. Jim studied her face, as if searching for cracks. For hypocrisy. For something to validate his skepticism. But he didn't find it. Instead, he found something steadier, conviction. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was reflective. For the first time since he walked onto that stage, the tension didn't feel like combat. It felt like two different philosophies colliding, neither fully victorious, neither fully defeated. And yet, there was still something unsaid, something lingering beneath Jim's calm exterior. Because this wasn't just about Hollywood. It wasn't just about fame. It was about identity. And the question that still hovered in the studio air was simple, but dangerous. Had Jim Carrey truly found himself? Or was this just another character trying to escape the spotlight? The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Jim Carrey sat back in his chair, fingers resting against his lips, as if holding back a thought that hadn't fully formed. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg maintained her steady composure, but the air between them felt thinner now, like oxygen had been replaced with something heavier. One of the co-hosts attempted a gentle pivot. Jim, when you talk about identity like this, do you ever miss the old version of you? The one who could walk into a room and just explode with energy. A faint smile touched his face. Sometimes, he admitted, he was fearless. Was? Whoopi asked quietly. Jim's eyes shifted toward her. He didn't think about consequences. He didn't question whether the laugh was worth it. And now you do. Yes. The honesty in that single word settled over the audience like a blanket. Whoopi leaned forward again, elbows on the table now mirroring his earlier posture. Growth changes us, she said. But it doesn't mean the earlier version wasn't real. Jim shook his head slightly. He was real, but he was also hungry. For what? She pressed. For approval. Jim replied without hesitation. The word cut deeper than anything he'd said so far. The audience responded with a low murmur of recognition. Approval. It was universal. Relatable. Whoopi's tone softened. And you think the rest of us aren't? Jim looked at her carefully. I think some people learn to balance it. I didn't. A producer's voice could be faintly heard off-camera urging the host to prepare for commercial, but no one moved. No one wanted to interrupt this. Whoopi tapped her fingers lightly against the table. You're describing something deeply human, she said. The need to be seen. To be valued. Yes, Jim agreed. But when millions of people are doing the seeing, it warps the value. A beat. Because it's too much? She asked. Because it's never enough, he answered. That line hung heavy. The audience didn't clap this time. They didn't gasp. They simply absorbed it. Whoopi studied him for a long moment before speaking again. Let me ask you something directly, she said. Do you regret your career? The bluntness of the question seemed to surprise even the crew. Jim's eyes widened slightly, not theatrically, but instinctively. He looked down at his hands, then back up at the crowd. No, he said slowly. I don't regret the work. Then what do you regret? Whoopi asked. Jim swallowed. The vulnerability was no longer subtle, it was exposed. I regret confusing applause with love. The silence that followed felt sacred. A woman in the audience visibly wiped at her eyes. Whoopi didn't rush to fill the space. She let it breathe. That's a hard lesson, she said finally. It nearly broke me, Jim admitted. The cameras captured every micro-expression, the tightening of his jaw, the faint tremor in his voice. Whoopi's posture shifted. Less defensive now. More reflective. But you're here, she said. You're talking about it. Jim nodded. Because maybe someone out there is chasing something they think will complete them. And you want to warn them. Yes. Even if it means dismantling the fantasy that built your success? She asked. Jim gave a small, almost ironic smile. Especially then. A few scattered claps emerged, tentative, emotional. Whoopi leaned back again, crossing her arms thoughtfully. There's something I need to challenge, though, she said. Jim looked ready. You speak as if the system is predatory, she continued. But it's made of people. People who create. People who dream. People who struggle just like you did. Jim nodded slowly. I know. So when you say illusion, she pressed, some hear fraud. I don't mean fraud, Jim clarified quickly. I mean projection. We project perfection. We project happiness. We project control. And you think that's harmful? I think it's exhausting, he replied. The audience laughed softly at that, relieved to find a sliver of levity again. Whoopi allowed a small smile. Life is exhausting, she countered. Yes, Jim agreed. But we don't have to pretend it isn't. The rhythm of the conversation had changed. It was no longer sharp edges and defensive stances. It felt like two veterans of the spotlight comparing scars. A co-host leaned in again. Jim, do you feel free now? He paused. The question lingered longer than expected. Some days, he answered honestly. Other days, I'm still unlearning. Unlearning what? Whoopi asked. That I have to earn my existence. The words struck the room like a quiet thunderclap. Whoopi's expression softened completely now. You don't, she said firmly. Jim gave a faint smile. Tell that to the 25-year-old version of me. The audience let out a collective exhale, some laughing gently, others nodding in silent understanding. Whoopi's voice grew reflective. You know, she said, there's power in recognizing you were chasing something unhealthy. But there's also power in acknowledging you built something meaningful along the way. Jim considered that. Do you believe the joy was real? She asked. Yes, he said immediately. The joy was real. Then it wasn't an illusion, she replied. The simplicity of that logic seemed to land differently this time. Jim tilted his head slightly. Maybe the joy was real, he conceded. But the pressure wasn't. And pressure exists everywhere, Whoopi reminded him. Yes, Jim agreed. But most people don't have it magnified on billboards. A soft ripple of laughter broke out again, gentler now, almost affectionate. The tension that had dominated the room earlier had transformed. It wasn't gone, but it had evolved into something deeper, more honest. Whoopi leaned forward one final time before the break. Let me ask you this, she said quietly. If you could go back and speak to that younger version of yourself, the one hungry for approval, what would you say? Jim's eyes glistened under the studio lights. I'd tell him, he said slowly, that he's enough before the applause. The audience erupted, not in wild cheers, but in heartfelt applause.
Some stood.
Whoopi nodded, visibly moved. That's something we can all use, she said. But even as the applause filled the studio again, there was an undercurrent still pulsing beneath the surface. Because while vulnerability had softened the clash, it hadn't erased the core tension. Jim had challenged the very foundation of performance culture. Whoopi had defended the resilience within it. And as the cameras prepared to cut to commercial, one question still lingered in the charged air. When the lights dim and the audience goes home, who are you without the stage? When the show finally cut to commercial, the applause didn't fade the way it usually did. It lingered uneven, emotional, uncertain. Some audience members remained standing longer than expected. Others stayed seated, staring at the stage as if trying to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't a viral shouting match. There had been no insults, no dramatic walk-offs. It was something rarer. It was exposure. As the cameras powered down and stagehands moved quietly around the set of The View, the energy in the room felt fragile. Jim Carrey remained seated for a moment longer than protocol required, hands resting on his knees, staring at nothing in particular. The same man who had entered like a whirlwind now looked grounded, almost heavy. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg adjusted her glasses slowly, studying him without hostility. The earlier tension had cooled into something more reflective, mutual,
Human.
One of the co-hosts leaned toward Jim and whispered something inaudible. He nodded, offering a small, grateful smile. No punchline. No bit. Just a man acknowledging the weight of a conversation. Whoopi finally spoke, but her voice was no longer projected for an audience. You know, she said quietly, these conversations don't usually happen on daytime television. Jim glanced at her. Maybe they should.
She didn't argue.
When the show returned from commercial for its closing segment, the tone was noticeably different. The usual light banter felt softer, the laughter gentler. As they wrapped up, Whoopi turned to Jim one last time. Thank you for being honest, she said simply. Jim nodded. Thank you for challenging me. The audience applauded again, but this time it wasn't for comedy. It wasn't for a catchphrase or a joke. It was for courage. And then it was over. But the silence that had filled that studio? It didn't stay there. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, social media ignited. Clips of the exchange began circulating online. Headlines appeared faster than producers could refresh their feeds. Jim Carrey calls out Hollywood illusion live on TV. Whoopi Goldberg pushes back in tense exchange. Laughter turns to silence on daytime talk show. On X, hashtags began trending. Some viewers praised Jim for his vulnerability, calling it one of the most authentic interviews of his career. Others applauded Whoopi for refusing to let sweeping generalizations go unchecked. Comment sections divided, but not with cruelty, with debate.
He's right.
Fame distorts everything.
No, she's right.
Accountability matters. He looked broken. He looked free. News outlets replayed the moment where Jim said, I regret confusing applause with love. The line echoed across timelines, stitched into reaction videos analyzed in podcasts, dissected by cultural commentators. Clips of Whoopi's response, then you close the chapter, but you don't burn the book, became just as viral. It wasn't a scandal. It was a reckoning. Backstage, sources later claimed the atmosphere had been surprisingly calm. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just two seasoned public figures quietly acknowledging that something meaningful had happened. Jim reportedly lingered a few minutes longer before leaving the studio, thanking crew members individually. Whoopi returned to her dressing room in thoughtful silence. Neither issued a statement that day. They didn't need to, because the moment spoke for itself. Viewers at home replayed the conversation with their families. Friends texted each other links. Therapists referenced it in sessions. Creators broke it down frame by frame. It struck a nerve because it wasn't about celebrity.
It was about identity.
About the masks people wear at work. About chasing validation. About mistaking performance for worth. For days afterward, commentators debated who had won the exchange. But that question missed the point. No one had won. No one had lost. Two people with different philosophies had collided in real time, without screaming, without collapsing into spectacle. And the silence that followed had said more than any joke could. In interviews later that week, when asked about the moment, Jim simply said he was grateful for the space to speak honestly. Whoopi, when questioned by reporters, responded with her signature steadiness. Conversations aren't battles. They're opportunities. The clip continued to circulate. Millions watched. Millions reacted. And somewhere, a young actor chasing fame paused and reconsidered what they were really pursuing. Somewhere else, a viewer who felt lost in their own career felt seen. Because in that studio, under those bright lights, something universal had slipped through the cracks of performance. The realization that applause is powerful, but it is not love. That illusion can inspire, but it can also overwhelm. And that even the funniest man in the room can carry silence inside him. Now, we want to hear from you. Was Jim Carrey right to challenge the culture of fame so openly? Or was Whoopi Goldberg right to defend the resilience within it? Did you see vulnerability or another performance? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in this conversation. And if you felt the weight of this moment, if you believe stories like this deserve to be told with honesty and intensity, make sure you subscribe to live narratives like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the loudest moments in television history aren't the ones filled with shouting. They're the ones where laughter fades and silence speaks.